I think their work provides particularly relevant and crucial insight. Our last event was about a panel about the police-free schools movement here in DC. And so I think these two events pair really nicely together. So to start us off tonight, Dr. Yolanda Anyon will speak on anti-oppressive and healing-centered approaches to interrupt the school-to-prison pipeline. Dr. Anyon is an associate professor of social work at the University of Denver. She received her BA in comparative studies in race and ethnicity from Stanford University and her MSW and PhD in social welfare from the University of California at Berkeley. Drawing on critical theories and mixed methods, Dr. Anyon's research centers the roles of public schools and community organizations in youth development. Her scholarship focuses on policies and practices that mitigate or contribute to opportunity gaps, with an emphasis on equity-oriented and youth-led strategies for advancing social justice. Dr. Anyon's current areas of interest include racial disparities in the school-to-prison pipeline, restorative approaches to discipline, and participatory action research with young people. So then we'll hear from Dr. Tara M. Brown, whose talk is titled Reconceptualizing Risk for School Leaving. Dr. Brown is an associate professor of education at the University of Maryland, College Park. She holds a doctorate degree in education from Harvard University. Dr. Brown is a former classroom teacher in secondary alternative certification. Her research focuses on the experiences of low-income adolescents and young adults of color attending or formerly served by urban public schools, particularly as related to disciplinary exclusion and high school non-completion. She specializes in qualitative, community-based, participatory, and action research methodologies. Her most recent research, Uncredentialed Young Adults Living Without a Secondary Degree, is a mixed methods, community-based, participatory action research study on the educational, socioeconomic, and criminal justice causes and implications of high school non-completion among young adults in a mid-sized post-industrial city. Dr. Brown is also the author and co-author of numerous articles on marginalized youth, school exclusion, school leaving, and participatory action research in academic journals such as the Harvard Education Review, Teachers College, Journal of Social Issues, Urban Education, and Youth in Society. So I will give a round of applause to welcome Dr. Anyon and Dr. Brown to join us tonight. So just a couple of quick logistics before we begin. So we're gonna, both Dr. Brown and Dr. Anyon will give their talks, and then we'll hold off on questions until the end. So at that time, please feel free to direct your questions to me directly in the chat, and we will have a nice conversation together about that. If you have any technical difficulties, please feel free to chat and Musica. I believe she reminded folks also of that in the chat. And finally, we welcome you to, we love some social media engagement, tweet about our panel tonight using the hashtag EDTR speaker series. And I think that's everything. So with that, I will stop talking and hand it over to Dr. Anyon.
All right, can you hear me now? Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me and for including a social worker in this conversation. I was honored to be invited and to be presenting with Dr. Brown, whose work is so important and interesting and compelling. So I'll share my screen. And if that worked. So before I get into the substance of my talk, I think it's my colleague Ramona Beltran talks about intellectual ancestors and the importance of acknowledging where your ideas come from. And instead of, citations, which I think can be difficult in a PowerPoint presentation environment like this, I just want to honor some people that have contributed to my thinking about these issues. So the first is my parents, Joan and Bob Anyon, who showed me really from a very young age what anti-oppressive and healing-centered approaches with youth look like in their own work with young people in San Diego. And the image at the top is a mural that the youth they worked with painted in a community called Sherman Heights. And then my aunt, Jean Anyon, who those of you in education might already be familiar with, she really nurtured my critical thinking about disparities in urban education contexts and what it means to be a scholar activist. And then at the bottom is another mural painted by the young people that I worked with in West Oakland, California, who taught me so much. But most of all, they really helped me understand my whiteness and how racism works in students' everyday lives. And then the last is Dr. Sean Ginwright, who has written about healing-centered engagement and provided for many years new language and perspectives about youth development. Okay, so I'm imagining that folk, are already familiar with the construct of the school to prison pipeline, but I think it's useful to remind ourselves about how chronic and serious these issues are and how they continue to be. So since the 90s, after a series of school shootings, the federal government introduced zero tolerance legislation, which is really what fueled the rise in the use of out of school suspensions and referral to law enforcement. And those kind of tough on crime, it mirrored the tough on crime policies that introduced harsh penalties that were independent of any kind of examination of context. It was just kind of like 3 strikes, you're out, that framework for thinking about responding to misconduct. And in addition to, sending students out of school through these punitive processes, the pipeline really goes in both directions in the increasing involvement of school resource officers, the use of police-like tools in schools, including metal detectors, security cameras, as ways to really survey young people. So this led to an explosion, in particular in out-of-school suspensions, which continues to impact over 3 million students annually. And for the most part, suspensions are not used in response to serious violent behavior. They're usually assigned for minor infractions like disrupting class, being tardy, and dress code violations. So as you might imagine, those kinds of responses to minor issues are not very effective and in many cases can be quite harmful. So the way that out of school suspensions can push young people into prison is by increasing their likelihood of having contact with juvenile justice or the criminal justice system writ large, which can then contribute to subsequent later arrest and incarceration. And that effect can be seen even once young people are out of schools. So later in life, the experience of being suspended in high school contributes to later arrest and incarceration. Of course, in addition to being ineffective, these practices are really inequitable. There are disparities among all kind of identity dimensions of difference. So students with disabilities, Black, Latinx, Native American students, low-income students, and LGBTQ students all tend to experience punitive and exclusionary discipline more often than their peers. And in studies that have looked at race and gender in particular, they tend to be punished more harshly for the exact same types of behaviors. So following a wave of activism and community organizing in that started really I mean, it's long lasting, but what has influenced more recent school discipline reform are like the books not bars movement, and the way that the origins of that in the, I would say, early to mid 2000s. And what young people and their family members and community members have really sounded the alarm about the harm that these practices and policies have on young people's lives. And these movements have had some success, especially in major urban cities, in changing policy so that suspensions are either not allowed in general, or they're not allowed for certain kinds of issues like willful defiance, or they're not allowed for certain age groups, like in Denver, it's kindergarten through 3rd grade. Or they've involved changes to codes of conduct that try to change the types of perceived misbehaviors that can even qualify for exclusionary or punitive approaches. So some examples of this are, I mentioned Denver banning it for pre-K through 3rd, LA, Syracuse, Miami, they've all instituted these kinds of policies that really are discrete changes to protocols. But even with these, we have seen dramatic drops in the out of school suspension in many of these districts. But even with those reforms, racial disparities and other kinds of disparities have persisted, have gotten larger, and in some ways have led to shifts in the use of other kinds of punitive and exclusionary responses. So in some districts, there's been increases in in-school suspension and direct referrals to law enforcement as schools try to circumvent essentially these kinds of mandates. So I'm going to try, I'm a little nervous about this, but I'm going to try to share a video clip as a way to talk about what is happening now. Let's see if we can do this. So I'm going to share a clip that is from The Breakfast Club, which is a classic movie from the 80s, and that some of you might be familiar with. And I guess what I want to preface this with is just recognizing that this was 40 years ago, and those of you who are still in schools to consider how similar or different this is than the kinds of punitive spaces that exist where you are.
Andrew Clark, get up here. Come on, front and center. Let's go.
Hey, how come Andrew gets to get up?
That's right.
If he gets up, we'll all get up. It'll be anarchy.
Okay, watch the magazines.
It's out of my hands. That's very clever, sir. But what if there's a fire? I think violating fire codes and endangering the lives of children would be unwise at this juncture in your career, sir.
All right, what are you doing with this? What are you doing with it? Get this out of here, for God's sake. What's the matter with you? Come on.
Well, you know the school comes equipped with fire exits at either end of the library.
Show Dick some respect.
Let's go. Go, get back in your seat. I expected a little more from a varsity letterman. You're not fooling anybody, Bender. The next screw that falls out is gonna be you.
Eat my shorts.
What was that?
Eat my shorts.
You just bought yourself another Saturday, mister.
Oh, I'm crushed.
You just bought one more right there.
Well, I'm free the Saturday after that. Beyond that, I'm gonna have to check my calendar.
Good, because it's going to be filled. We'll keep going. You want another one? Say the word. Just say the word. Instead of going to prison, you'll come here. Are you through?
No.
I'm doing society a favor.
So?
That's another one right now. I've got you for the rest of your natural-born life if you don't watch your step. You want another one?
Yes.
You got it. You got another one right there. That's another one, pal.
Cut it out.
You through?
Not even close, bud.
Good. You got one more right there.
You really think I give a shit?
Another. You through?
How many is that?
That's 7, including the one when we first came in. You asked Mr. Vernon here whether Barry Manilow knew that he raided his closet.
Now it's 8. You stay out of it.
Excuse me, sir, it's 7.
Shut up, Pee-wee. You're mine, Bender. For 2 months, I got you. I got you.
So as humorous as that clip is, unfortunately, in our qualitative research in schools in a reform district, this is pretty similar to what in-school suspension rooms look like, even to this day in a district that tries to encourage the use of alternative approaches like restorative practices. And some things that I think are particularly upsetting about this video, but again, are consistent with what we observed that we didn't videotape and can't share, is the reference to the criminal justice system in conversations with young people. So at one point, the dean says, you know, you're going to be here instead of jail, kind of implying that criminalizing just basic developmentally appropriate behavior. The use of escalating approaches, so poking, scolding, denigrating, ways of interacting with young people, and then the number, you know, the adding of additional detentions, additional suspensions. That's what we've also observed, that we've actually seen cases of, you know, 32 suspensions in a school year. So as much as this seems extreme, oh goodness, I don't know what just happened. Are we back? Yeah, okay. I have no idea. Oh, the host disabled screen sharing because of that. Is there a way, Anne, to let me back in to share mine? Yeah, okay, let's see.
Apologies to interrupt, Dr. Anyon. I just wanted to say to everyone that Zoom bombing will not be tolerated and you will be ejected from this event.
I've never been Zoom bombed before, so hey, it's a learning experience for me. Okay, so what is the problem with these recent reforms? Why are we getting essentially the same kinds of practices happening just in the school building instead of sending young people out? And my argument is that these recent reforms, that some which focus on like positive behavioral interventions, encouraging schools to use restorative practices, have not ended up minimizing racial disparities or fundamentally altering school discipline because they're not addressing the root causes of why the school to prison pipeline exists. So it keeps shifting and transforming. So I would argue these reforms haven't worked because they don't reallocate resources. For example, taking police officers out of schools. Oh. Did it happen again? Taking police officers out of schools doesn't fundamentally change the kinds of dynamics that are happening between educators and students that lead to exclusionary and punitive practices. So it feels unreasonable to me to expect practices to shift without changing how resources are allocated. So we need additional investments in supporting teachers and creating wraparound strengths-based services in schools that I'll talk a little bit more about later. We also tend to, these reforms ignore intersectional forms of oppression. So they don't address the many forms of discrimination, bias, and dominance that lead to discipline disparities. I'm not sure, can you guys see the slide, or are you getting the error message that I'm getting? You are, okay. I can also just, I don't need to use the slides. Maybe I'll just try speaking directly to y'all. So these policies, by not addressing intersectional forms of oppression, tend to reject, erase, or deny how inequality shapes young people's lives and their experiences in schools. These policies also tend to blame and stigmatize. So they don't, even the use of like trauma-informed practices don't consider trauma in historical, political, or cultural context. And in the absence of that can amplify deficit discourses about youth and their families. So for example, a commonly used tool to assess trauma is the average childhood experiences screening tool. And one of the items is if your parent is incarcerated, that's considered an indicator of trauma. And I would argue that without connecting parental incarceration to mass incarceration, we are simply reproducing the same dialogue about those communities. So I think that leads to victim blaming and labeling interventions that target individual students rather than systems, which can lead to more alienation and challenging behavior. The last limitation is that they prioritize conformity and compliance. So when rules and expectations are based on what make people like me, meaning white, middle class, cisgender, straight people comfortable, then it's always going to disproportionately impact the young people who are seen as different. And the focus ends up being on managing and regulating emotions rather than expressing them and resisting the inequitable conditions that lead to that kind of distress. So it essentially leads to punishment and exclusion that's justified based on difference. Oh, I can't see the slide. Okay, so the alternative, I think there's two pieces. One is anti-oppressive approaches, and the second is healing-centered. Anti-oppressive approaches aim to recognize that different systems of oppression, racism, misogyny, homophobia, create and sustain collective and individual trauma. So in the absence of anti-racist, anti-homophobic efforts in schools, we'll continue to have interpersonal violence that is connected to structural violence. Acknowledging collective traumas also means highlighting community heroes and leaders who've cultivated wellness and healing historically and contemporaneously as our models, as our leaders in this work, and bringing those inequalities related to race, gender, and sexuality into conversations about conflict in schools. The second, and part of that in terms of emphasizing critical consciousness is recognizing that there's many sides to the same story. That youth, not only adults, have valuable perspectives about what happens in moments of conflict. And part of that means that we have to reframe being uncomfortable and feeling unequipped as part of everyone's work, not just young people's. Okay, I'm gonna try. I just love this image, so I want to try sharing my screen again. So healing-centered approaches really are about bringing strengths, talents, and dreams into these efforts. And the image that is at the bottom was part of a poster contest for restorative practices and reflects the idea of that young people can be a part of figuring out the solution and articulating what needs to happen to make something right. But affirming strengths, talents, and dreams can happen as a part of that. It means that when we have conversations with young people about any harm that was caused in moments of conflict, that we also acknowledge that they're more than their trauma, they're more than their deficits, and that the solutions to conflict, the solutions to the school to prison pipeline build from young people's talents and dreams. And that means rewarding their critical thinking, effort, and improvement rather than competition, comparison, and compliance, and honoring and integrating culturally affirming rituals and traditions, in particular, the indigenous origins of approaches like restorative practices. Co-constructing solutions with young people means engaging students in creating classroom agreements, school-wide expectations, and that those include both youth and adults. The expectations are not just about how students should act, but also how adults should interact with each other and with young people. And that there's shared responsibility in resolving conflict and harm, and that collective decision-making should reflect that shared responsibility. And instead of the zero tolerance idea of a one-size-fits-all approach to consequences, using, for lack of a better word, consequences that are related to the root cause of the incident. And you can often build on young people's strengths as a part of that. So I've seen where young artists have developed like anti-bullying campaigns when they were involved with visuals in their school building. So there's all sorts of ways that we can use the experience of conflict, and when we as adults experience young people as having challenging behaviors, as an opening for more community building and for more connection. So I think the implications of this argument are that we need to flip the script from seeing young people as problems to young people as resources. And that means engaging young people as partners and leaders in promoting healing and equity. I also think there's something that is rarely gets addressed in policy conversations is the role of mindsets and values in how that shape adults and young people's interactions in schools. So cultivating, cultural humility and critical consciousness are as important as any one set of practices of teaching educators to use. And I think that means investing resources in interventions that target adults and professionals and systems as much as we invest in interventions that target young people. And then the last implication is looking at fidelity to a set of principles like the ones that I've articulated today, in addition to a set of practices like restorative practices or trauma-informed practices. There are ways to use those same practices if you're done from a punitive mindset in ways that can be exclusionary and that can harm young people's sense of self and their sense of belonging. So part of that, I think, means moving beyond old school discipline systems that only document, a practice and not fidelity to the principles. Part of the problem also with tracking that way is that when an approach doesn't work, if it's not done with fidelity, the approach itself is blamed rather than the fact that it wasn't done the way it was intended to be implemented. And so I think building on teacher observations and student surveys are ways to do that. So I'll stop there and I'll hand it over to Dr. Brown. Yeah. Hope you don't have the same technical difficulties, but I appreciate everyone's patience.
Okay, I'm gonna share my screen. I hope the Zoom bombing is over because I'm a visual person, so I need my slides. All right, let me share the screen here. I'm gonna go. All right, we good? Thumbs up. Everyone can see? Okay, excellent, excellent. All right, thank you everyone for coming. It's great to have such a good crowd. And also I wanna say that I'm also honored to be on this panel with Yoli. She does fabulous work that's very much akin to my own. So Kristen gave you much more of an introduction than I thought she would. So she did some of my work for me. So I guess I'll just say in this presentation, reconceptualizing risk for school leaving, I am going to invite you to think about risk, which is a very common idea in education, to think about it in ways you may not have thought about it before. So I'm going to cover my background, some of which you already heard, kind of talk about how I came to my interest in school leaving and risk, and then talk about these two topics kind of from a conventional point of view. And then I'm going to talk about some different conceptualizations of risk. And then talk about how risk for school leaving is produced in school contexts. And then I'm going to end with points to consider and also some recommendations, especially for school practitioners. Okay, so as Kristen told you, I'm a former high school teacher, taught for 10 years. I've taught social studies, I taught technology, computers, also taught research methods with high school students. And all of my teaching has been in urban high schools, predominantly Black and Latinx students. And most of that time I spent in alternative schools. So those are the schools for young people who've been suspended long-term, and also young people that are coming out of juvenile detention facilities. So these are young people that are considered to be at high risk for school leaving. As Kristen said, my research focus is school exclusion, particularly school leaving, which you may know as high school dropout. I'm not using the dropout terminology anymore. I keep switching my terminology. Now I'm settled on school leaving. And also disciplinary exclusion, suspension, and expulsion as well. And my research methodology is participatory action research, which means I conduct research with individuals from the populations that I study. And I also focus on interventions into the problems that I'm studying. So for example, I did a PAR study on school leaving, the uncredentialed study, which Kristen mentioned, and I'll talk about more later, in which 3 young men who didn't have a high school diploma or a GED served as my co-researchers on the study, and they participated in all aspects of the research. So I'm going to put up a quick picture here of just a few of my PAR teams. So I've done PAR work inside of schools and outside of schools. And that picture on the bottom is my team in the uncredentialed study. So before I go into the real meat of the presentation, I kind of wanted to start off with a little bit of good news. So I'm just showing you, this is a graph of graduation rates for Black, Latinx, and white students over the course of 2010 to 2016. The good news is, as you can see, graduation rates for all 3 of these groups have steadily risen. But you'll also notice that the gap between white students that are at the top and then Black and Latinx students, although it's been shrinking slowly, it's still very significant. So I'm really interested, I've been interested in why Black and Latinx students have disproportionately low graduation rates. So as researchers do, when we begin to examine a problem, I looked at what other researchers have found and how they explain what's going on in this problem space. And you'll probably be familiar with a lot of the things that I found. So, in addition to Black and Latinx students, there are other particular student populations that have disproportionate rates of school leaving. Also Native American, some Asian ethnic groups, especially Southeast Asians, young people who have parents or siblings that left school before graduating, English language learners, young people from single parent homes, undocumented youth, young people in foster care, young people from low income families, and homeless youth, and LGBTQIA youth as well. And because these students groups do have disproportionate rates of school leaving, these characteristics are often framed as risk factors for school leaving. I'm sure we've all heard of the idea of risk factors.
I'm sorry, Dr. Brown, can I interrupt you for one moment?
Yeah.
I'm unsharing your screen. Whoever is writing on the screen, get out of this Zoom room now.
Let me know when we're good. So are you going to share my PowerPoint?
Yes, sorry about that.
And so then I just give you a signal when you need to go to the next?
Yes, just a next slide, please, would be great.
Okay, all right. Okay, so all of these risk factors really have to do with a student background and characteristics, family background, but there are also some identified risk factors that specifically pertain to the school context. Next slide, please. So some of those school-related risk factors that are associated with students are truancy and absenteeism, suspension, expulsion, receiving special education services, having poor grades, or being retained. I'm sure people are familiar with these. And then more recently, I would say probably in the last 10 years or so, there's been more emphasis on looking at schools. And so there's this work on what they call dropout factories. So these schools that have high rates, high schools with high rates of dropout, and some of the risk factors that they've identified for these schools are schools that have large populations of minoritized and low income students, and that have high suspension rates. So interestingly, or maybe not, what I was reading, it didn't exactly match up with what I was learning from my work with young people. So the young people who I've taught, who I've done research with, and have also been subjects in different studies that I've done with my PAR teams, were describing a lot of school-based factors that they considered contributing to their leaving school that I didn't see much of in the research literature. So you can even see on this chart, these risk factors that are associated with schools, they actually have to do with students. So it's just like taking the risk factors of students and when they're concentrated in schools. So this inconsistency between what I was reading about and experiencing with young people through teaching and research raised some really important questions for me. Okay, next slide. All right, so especially looking at this research, looking at the middle school to high school transition, I noticed that students were being framed as at risk because of things in their educational history and also background characteristics. So being framed as at risk for graduating from high school before they even entered high school. So this raised a question for me. Can one's risk for a particular outcome be independent of the context that makes that outcome possible? So, for example, you know, we know that Black boys have a disproportionate rate of school leaving, but there's certainly nothing inherent about being Black or being a boy that puts one at risk for not graduating. So there must be something going on in the school context that is producing risk for Black boys. And then the other question that came to my mind is, okay, if students are at risk for school leaving before they even enter high school, how might high schools be at risk for not graduating students who have not yet entered the building? So are there particular things about this school that are independent of the students that are already setting a context for producing risk? And then as I asked these questions, I started thinking, what exactly is risk? And I realized that I didn't have a good definition for it. I mean, even though I used the term a lot, I read about it a lot. So then I started digging into literature on risk, and I'm going to show you a little bit of what I found. Next slide. So I'll start off with a definition of risk that I'm pretty satisfied with now. And so risk, broadly defined, refers to relationships between uncertainty and activities, events and outcomes, and how current circumstances impact future circumstances where something of value is at stake. And that last quote there is from Avon and Wren's article, 2009 article in the Journal of Risk Research. I didn't even know there was a Journal of Risk Research before I started digging into this topic. The other thing that I learned is that there are two general conceptualizations of risk: the objective perspective and the constructive perspective. Okay, you can go to the next. So the objective perspective, this is the dominant conceptualization of risk in education and probably in other social science areas, and I'm sure you're going to be very familiar with this. So students are, from this view, students are at risk for negative educational outcomes, you know, due to their background, their characteristics, and their behaviors. And that risk factors, and we saw a whole list of them, risk factors increase the probability of experiencing the negative outcome. In this case would be school leaving. And probability is an operative word from this perspective, because much of this work is quantitative, and risk is assessed statistically through correlations between different factors. And then lastly, the risk largely belongs to the student who brings her risk to bear on her school experiences. So you can see my little picture there of this girl, and with these different risk factors that are tethered to her. And so she has these risk factors that belong to her. She has a risk profile, and then she brings that into the school context with her. Okay, you can go to the next. So the next perspective, which I discovered, and it took me a long time to wrap my head around this, is the constructivist perspective of risk. So in this view, risk is akin to uncertainty rather than probability. So you could use risk and uncertainty interchangeably from this perspective, which I often do. And risk in this way is socially constructed. So risks are artifacts or products of social processes. And in this perspective, the significance of risk lies in how people experience risk or uncertainty in their everyday lives. And I'm going to describe 3 dimensions of experiencing risk. So the first is detection. So kind of when people first detect risk or uncertainty about some particular outcome, and the circumstances that bring them to that awareness is called risk information. Then the second is how people respond to that risk information. Once they sense some uncertainty, then how do they deal with it? And this is called risk processing. So importantly, people process risk in interactions with each other, and also in interaction with the different rules and norms and cultures of the institutional contexts in which they are embedded. And then last is the eventuation of risk processing, is sort of the outcomes of these processes. Okay, you can go to the next slide. All right, so this is a conceptual map I put together that I hope will make things a little bit clearer, because this concept has a lot of different moving parts. But so this would pertain to the school context. So this circle represents risk and its production in the school context. And you can see many different groups. These are not even all of them, but these are some of the groups that would be involved in detecting, processing, and producing risk and its outcomes. And they would be doing this in interaction with each other, and also in interaction with school policies and normative school practices. So I think one of the main takeaways from this is that all these different constituents are involved in the social construction of risk. So risk belongs to everybody, not just the student. It belongs to everyone, and everyone participates in increasing or decreasing risk through the ways that they process these uncertainties. Okay, so what I'm going to do next is I'm going to move on to show how these conceptualizations could actually be applied to everyday experiences in the school context. And to do this, I'm going to draw on findings from the PARS study on school leaving. I'm just going to give you a real little background on the study. If you can go to the next slide. So the uncredentialed study, it actually was broader, it was the mixed methods, but the data that I'm going to really draw on for this presentation were individual interviews with 43 18 to 24-year-olds that didn't have a high school diploma or a GED. And all of them attended predominantly Latinx, what they call failing, it was a turnaround, failing urban school in the Northeastern US. And the PAR team, we also did analysis of the school policies to get more of a sense of the context of the school. So just keep in mind, aside from the policies, that what I'm going to talk about is primarily from the perspectives of these young people. Okay, next slide. All right. So I'm going to start off just sort of laying out some of the aspects of the school context that are going to be important for what I'm going to talk about next. The attendance, academic and discipline policies, and then also a lack of policy, no policy for students to actually address their grievances, particularly around relationships and with teachers and how they are being treated in class. And then in terms of normative practices in the school, what the young people reported was poor oversight of students. So they kind of, like a lot of large urban schools, it was, students described it as kind of a chaotic environment where the school personnel were not keeping good track of students. You know, they're going to different lunches, they're skipping class, people are coming in and out of the building. So there's that lack of oversight. And then they all talked about poor communication with them and with parents. So poor communication about, you know, student progress, academic progress, other difficulties, and also communication about the school policies and students and families' rights and responsibilities. So next, I'm going to show you 2 pathways that depict the production of risk in the school context. So bear with me, I'm going to walk you through this. So we're going to start over the left where it says enter 9th grade. So I'm sort of going to take, this is a common pathway for a lot of the young people that were in this study. So upon entering 9th grade, even though all of the participants in the study could be considered at risk for school leaving because of different, characteristics and experiences, they did not understand themselves as at risk. They didn't think about themselves as at risk. And I think all of these young people, and most of, I would say the vast majority of young people that I taught 9th grade for a bunch of years. When they enter the 9th grade, they fully expect to graduate. So they're not detecting any risk. So most of the young people in this study started running into difficulties that were actually heightening the risk in an objective sense. So a lot of the young people were skipping school, skipping classes, and having academic difficulties. And some of the institutional factors that were contributing to this was poor communication with parents. So they talked about how parents weren't being informed that they weren't coming to school, they weren't being informed about academic difficulties, and also that lack of oversight, that kind of chaos in the school was creating a context, especially for the skipping school and classes, because people were not watching, so they were going in and out of the building. So for almost all of the participants, the moment that they detected risk or uncertainty about their pathway to graduation is when they had a course failure. And for most of them, it was that first semester of 9th grade. So this is when they said, uh-oh, I think, I might be headed for trouble. And so the context, the institutional context of this failure had to do with the attendance policy. There was a very stringent attendance policy, like a lot of schools. So if you had 4 or more absences, like in a semester in a class, then you failed that semester automatically. If you had 9 or more absences over the course of a year, you automatically failed that course for the year. So there were many students who, 9 absences, it seems like a lot, but some of them within 2 months, they had already exceeded the number of absences for the year. So they automatically failed for the year, even like 2 months into the school year. And that goes back to the poor communication, because they talked about how they didn't understand this. They didn't understand the policy, and they didn't understand the significance of missing those classes. And another contextual factor, you can see no makeup work. So according to the attendance and discipline policy, if you had an unexcused absence, you were not allowed to make up the work from those days that you missed, which then contributed to the academic difficulties. And so lastly, I want to say, when a student detects risk only when they fail a class for the semester of the year, that's already too late. You see my little bubble, too late. So it's really important that students and parents are made aware when young people are sort of headed for trouble before a course failure actually happens. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we'll start at the left again. So we have our students that, okay, now they've detected risk. They know that something is up, and they need to, now they're going to process this uncertainty they have about their pathway. And so there are probably other people involved, but I'm just going to focus on the student and teacher. So students and teachers are processing risk in relationship with each other. And so the young people talked about different ways that they process risk and different ways that teachers did. So some of them talked about really just getting discouraged from that course failure and maybe not getting support, then disengaging. And then there were others that really buckled down and said, okay, I gotta try harder and get myself on track. And they talked about teachers. Some teachers doubled down on the support when they realized the student was falling behind. And then there were other teachers that actually withdrew support. So we had numerous young people that said, I got discouraged. Once I gave up, the teacher gave up as well. So it's important to understand that the students and teachers have a mutual impact on the ways that they process risk. And also important in this context was the academic policy in terms of sort of the outcome of this round of processing. So according to the academic policy, which I think is common in a lot of schools, so students who failed English, or if they failed 2 of their core courses in a school year, then they were automatically retained. So this policy mandate foreclosed some opportunities for students to actually recover from failure and for students to support them to get back on track and not fall behind a grade. Nonetheless, some of the participants did manage to get back on track, and some of them actually failed the grade. Okay, next. All right, so then we'll follow those students that had a grade failure. They're in 9th grade. Now, this is also risk information. Now there's a heightened detection. This is a very significant piece of information for them. And they're really like, whoa, I'm really at risk here. So then going again into that, that processing with the student and teacher, as I explained before. And then the various outcomes were some students were able to get on track. Others failed the 9th grade a second time. We had students in the study who failed 3 and 4 times the 9th grade, which you can imagine is completely demoralizing. And then there were others who just kind of, just gave up and just figured they weren't going to make it, so they left school. Okay, so I'm going to show one more pathway. If you can go to the next slide. So this has to do with disciplinary problems, because this track is a little bit different, although some of the students were like on multiple tracks at the same time. So we'll start in the middle with ongoing discipline problems. So, in the beginning of the year, when they had maybe 1 or 2 suspensions, they didn't recognize that as a risk, even though in an objective sense, we know that even 1 suspension, the probability goes up that a student's going to leave. But then once the discipline problem started being ongoing, that's when they detected the uncertainty. So having multiple classroom removals, detentions, and suspensions. So I'm going to go back out to the left. A lot of the young people described these discipline problems in connection with poor relationships with teachers. They talked about being disrespected, being humiliated and embarrassed in class, and just really feeling devalued. And they really felt, going back to that lack of grievance procedures, they really felt they didn't have any way to actually register their concerns and have them addressed for what they felt was this poor treatment. So some of them resorted to intentionally disrupting class and giving the teacher a hard time as a strategy to deal with, kind of register their unhappiness with the teacher. And of course, then this feeds back into the ongoing discipline problems. So with this risk information, and especially with suspension, going then again into this processing phase, where you have students, teachers, and now once you're getting suspended, administrators are also involved, maybe school counselors as well, all processing risk in relationship with each other. And some outcomes were expulsion. Some good number of these students actually ended up getting expelled, and some just, again, just gave up and decided to leave school. And another contextual aspect that's important, again, is the poor communication. So one thing that we learned from a lot of the young people is they weren't fully informed of their due process rights. And this is particularly around expulsion. So it really put them at a disadvantage. So many of them were expelled, at least as they described it. They were expelled for infractions that, according to the discipline code, did not merit an expulsion. But a lot of them just had ongoing problems, and it sounded like the principal was just sick of them and just told them, just get out, just leave school. And they didn't realize that they had any recourse. So these two pathways that I just showed is really to depict how risk or uncertainty gets produced. And it can be both increased and decreased. And also to show how multiple people are involved in this production, in their interactions with each other, and with the school policies and practices. Okay, I'm winding down. All right, so I'm going to go to some points I'd like people just to leave here with, to maybe think about. So think about risk. So risk has both objective and socially constructed or subjective dimensions, which interact in ways that contribute to uncertainty about high school graduation or uncertainty about any income. And then how, why, and when people detect risk influences how they respond to it. And how people process risk information in interactions with each other can decrease or increase uncertainty and influence its outcome. Next slide, please. Also, risk belongs to everyone involved in a young person's education. And particularly in the school context, thinking about school hierarchies of power, and especially with minoritized students, the adults in the school tend to have the most power in these processes, but the students bear the greatest burden of risk. So although multiple people are involved in producing and processing risk for school leaving, there's an inequitable, what they call distribution of risk. So if the risk actually eventuates in school leaving, the stakes are highest for the student. So we might think about how we could more equitably distribute risk for school leaving in the school context. And that may be holding adults more accountable. I think, not maybe, it does mean holding adults more accountable. And then also I would ask for practitioners to think about how is your school, or how might your school be at risk for losing students before graduation? Are there policies, lack of policies, or normative practices that contribute to risk or increase risk for school leaving? And how can you, as a teacher, an administrator, a school counselor, decrease the risk or uncertainty for school leaving? And then my last slide are some recommendations that come out of this study. So absolutely close communication with students and families, and making sure that they are familiar, that they know the policies, that they know their rights and responsibilities. And I really don't think just sending students home with a student handbook or having parents sign off on the code of conduct is not enough for a lot of people. So think of creative ways, meetings or workshops, so that they really have an understanding of that information. And also addressing students' difficulties early on, having like what they call an early detection or early warning system, I would definitely recommend. And then maybe thinking of creative pathways for students to recover, multiple pathways to recover from, absences, academic failure, and disciplinary infractions. So these policies are often put in place actually to keep students on track, these real stringent policies. But often for some students, they work in the opposite way. So I would really ask people to consider, if you have these zero tolerance policies around attendance, discipline or academics, to really think about ways that you can provide avenues for students to recover from missteps. And then lastly, to have some official mechanisms for students to register their grievances or concerns, especially in relationships with teachers, and have them addressed so they feel like they don't, their only recourse is to either skip the class or disengage or give the teacher a hard time. Okay, so thank you. I will stop there.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Anyon and Dr. Brown. First, I would just like to deeply apologize to both of our guests and to the audience for the Zoom bombing. We are certainly going to make much stronger efforts in the future to make sure that this is a protected space, and that will not happen again. We'd like to invite folks to put questions in the chat right now. We've got about 15 minutes to get to some questions. And I'm sure I really appreciated how we saw a lot of intersections between, I think, the research and the points that you both brought up. So I'm eager to jump into a conversation. So the first question I have for you, and I noticed that both of you ended your presentations talking about the need to hold adults accountable too. And I think this question is an extension of that. So the question is, how do the panelists view the role of responsible teacher and administrator recruitment practices in mitigating exclusionary and punitive discipline practices? So the person who asked this question speaks from personal experience that I've seen white teachers over-refer Black and Brown students to restorative justice spaces in every school I've worked in, and oftentimes those facilitating restorative conversations are white as well. We can talk about research distribution as much as we want, but for me, the root cause of the problem is the inability to engage in culturally sustained or trauma-informed practices because of a fundamental lack of personal experience. So this process of learning and unlearning is an iterative long-term process during which teachers are failing and learning from mistakes, and students continue to be marginalized. So calls for resource distribution turn into increased training for white teachers rather than critical analysis of who is teaching our students in the first place. So the question is, what reforms have either of you seen that might work with regards to getting more Black and Brown teachers in Black and Brown classrooms? And I guess to what extent might that be an effective response to the concerns that you all raise here too?
I think that's comment is consistent with what educators in the districts that we've done research have said, that I think in Denver, the teaching faculty is 90% white and the student body is 80% students of color. And there's research that has demonstrated white teachers, just the pattern that the question that was observed in the question. So some innovative strategies that I've seen, one are using asking different kinds of questions in teacher interviews. So a lot, asking about relationship building, asking about mindsets, there's some alternative screening tools. I can look while Tara's addressing this, Dr. Brown's addressing this question, that basically get at mindsets, and having that be a part of the conversation, that's something that is a value that teachers of color bring, that is above and beyond expertise in a particular kind of content area or a set of credentials. And then the other thing is like social justice oriented teacher education programs. I mean, I think there's too few of these kinds of programs in the country. There's just not enough explicit attention to inequality and also youth development and youth empowerment in teacher education, which I think is can mitigate some of these dynamics. So I'll look at the screening tool while Dr. Brown responds.
Yeah, I agree with all of those. I also think that, you know, school administrators or principals have a lot of responsibility when it comes to these issues. I think about where I did most of my teaching at an alternative school in Boston Public Schools. And we had a principal who was very intentional about creating opportunities for students and teachers to build relationships. And he also really held teachers accountable for the way that they treated young people. And another thing, and this might be, I think sometimes in alternative schools, there's a little more flexibility, unfortunately, because the expectations are low for that population of students. So they're like, you can just, as long as you keep them under wraps, you can do what you want. But we had, you know, there were definitely discipline mandates from the district that we had to abide by. But in terms of the school rules, we had a collaborative process working with students to generate the school rules and the consequences for different infractions. And people might think, oh, well, if they, you know, they're making up the consequences, they're going to want to get away with, you know, murder. Actually, they were tougher than the staff were. We had to say, whoa, no, we don't want to go that far. And the other thing I think that really helped in that school is students, teachers who were applying to the school had to teach a class, well, multiple classes with students during the day, and students participated in that evaluation process around hiring the teacher, which really helped a lot in terms of the relationships. And the principal, we would have a lot of conversations and negotiations, but you know, if there were many students that didn't like the teacher, didn't have a good impression, I mean, they had to give some valid reasons, which they always did. He would not hire teachers that the students were not supportive of. That's hard to do because you have unions, but I think pie in the sky, what Dr. Anyon said about empowering students, I think is a real key piece.
Yeah, and empowering youth to make, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
I was gonna say, empowering youth to make really consequential decisions about the people who are gonna be teaching them, I think is really powerful.
The name of the tool is the Haberman Foundation STAR Teacher Questionnaire that tries to get about mindsets, in particular related to poverty and racism. So that's one tool administrators can use to, it's not a perfect tool, but it's, I think, adding that to the hiring process. And then just in terms of the resource allocation, I mean, I agree that professional development that targets white teachers doesn't address like the fundamental issue of the pipeline of teachers of color, but I do think we need resources to expand the pipeline for teachers of color. Think about like housing credits for teachers, at the ways that make the teaching profession something that's more sustainable. Yeah, so that's all. Just, I think resources are a part of it, just maybe not in the way we've used them typically in schools to address these issues.
Great, thank you. This is another question for Dr. Brown, and kind of brings the issues y'all have been talking about into our current COVID era. So if attendance and grades are seen as indicators of risk for school leaving, how can we best advocate right now or draw attention to right now the schools that are failing students based on attendance policies when students are unable to access tech Wi-Fi for virtual school?
I haven't given that a whole lot of thought, but I did meet with a group of student activists yesterday in Baltimore, and they were talking about, yeah, really having difficulty accessing, not having, for multiple reasons, for, the Wi-Fi goes down, not having enough devices in the class, or having to be home with younger siblings, and also, like sort of facilitating their education as well. I don't know. I think that, yeah, I think they talked about in Baltimore public schools, the schools seem to be, more flexible around attendance because of those issues. But unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for that. That's really a struggle.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I'm curious if relatedly, either of you have a sense of sort of the implications of our virtual learning context for discipline practices in general, how those have shifted and responded to this context, and if you see any more or less opportunities for things like restorative justice or healing centered approaches in this context.
My sense is that many feel so overwhelmed by the demand, these new demands, that issues like approaches like relationship building have kind of dropped down. Time when I think connection is probably more important than content delivery, but because there's so much pressure to like make it the same online as it was in person in terms of content, I've seen these issues get pushed to the side in terms of the conversation, but in reality, it's playing out at virtual spaces. So police officers have been sent to students' homes in Colorado when a teacher has seen a toy gun in two different incidents. So we don't even have SROs in this context, and yet administrators still found a way to get police officers in these young people's lives. So I think they're equally as relevant, if not more. And it's been hard for me to watch how it plays out in terms of muting young people, putting them in breakout rooms and there was an article in the New York Times where they were talking to Black parents who were able now to see how teachers were interacting with their children, and were like, I'm never sending them back,
Right.
Related to this also is they've surveyed, parents about sending students back, and Black and Latinx parents are less likely than white parents to want to go back to in-person learning. I think some of that certainly is like the disproportionate burden, but I think in general, we have not made schools, schools are not safe places for many Latinx, many Black children. So I think the idea that we can just like ignore these dynamics in a virtual space is really misguided, because continuing to send the message to these families that you don't matter and you won't.
Right.
Thanks for that. Another question here. So as you know, a lot of the folks in the audience are educators who are at the beginning of their careers, or about to be at the beginning of the careers. So can you speak to a little bit about how teachers, particularly first year teachers and educators, can advocate and facilitate some of these shifts in dispositions and policies with their colleagues?
Yeah, that can be tough. I mean, I think it also has to do with the particular school context that you're in. I realize how difficult that is, because if you're coming into a school as a new teacher in a context where this advocacy and these kinds of practices and that you dreamed you're going to do are not being supported, by, you know, the more senior faculty and the administrators. It's really, really difficult. And also as a first year teacher, you have so many things that you're learning. And then I remember my first year of teaching, I used to come home and go to bed at like 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I would just be exhausted. I guess I would say to new teachers that it can be a real struggle to do this on top of everything else. But if you, I mean, hopefully you'll have a principal that will support this. If there are, you know, teachers that have been there longer that actually support them, so try to create a relationship and a support network with them. And if you kind of find yourself in a desert in that sense, I would say just hold on to those dreams and those, you know, as you get more established and you have things down and you kind of get more status in the school, then you'll have other opportunities. But I know like a lot of new teachers, then they just abandon it and they say, I can't do it. And become among, you know, the ranks of teachers who have kind of, you know, just kind of fall into the, you know, just become institutionalized. But I would say, you know, keep those hopes alive, because it's so important for young people.
I'm in terms of other adults in the building. I mean, when we did a bunch of interviews and focus groups in low suspending schools, and one theme that came out was that there was a culture among staff that it was okay to make mistakes and to ask for help, because often when it comes to like young people with behavior that adults find challenging, especially as a first year teacher, I think there's a feeling of like embarrassment or shame if you can't like manage the situation in a way that other people will perceive as effective, and that your own vulnerability with your colleagues about how difficult these kinds of situations are can cultivate vulnerability in others in a way that can shift mindsets. If there's a feeling that young people make mistakes, we make mistakes, and we all learn from them together. And then the other kind of ethos that was common in these schools was like all young people are our responsibility, everyone in the building, not just the ones that are in my classroom. That changed the dynamic between staff, because then it's not between faculty. It's not like that's your classroom, close the door and you do your thing and I do my thing, but it's like we're in this together. But I do think that a lot of that comes from the top, from leadership. And I guess that would be another piece of advice for a teacher is, you know, interview the school leader as much as being interviewed about like their values and their priorities. And if relationships are not at the top of the list, their relationship with you and your relationship with colleagues won't be either.
Yeah.
Thanks. I think that's really important advice, that you get to interview the school as much as they get to interview you.
Right.
So the last question I think is a really good one to wrap up on. And this question is kind of about what role do students' communities play in kind of all the work that you're talking about. So in order to retain students, is it a possibility that these schools may need to consult and or seek the help of the community in which the schools and students are located in, and what might that look like?
Yes, I think that's a huge part of healing-centered approaches. You know, it's discouraging to hear, for example, that most restorative practice coordinators are white. I think that credentialing, and just that because of the nature of pipelines in higher education, one way to increase the pipeline of teachers of colors is to start with community members entering the building in other kinds of roles like restorative practice coordinators, and building on traditions that are indigenous to those communities, like drumming circles or mentorship programs. There's lots of ways that community members can be involved without like the kind of formal education that's required to hire a teacher, and that being in the building can then gain not only is a benefit to the students and the faculty, but can also be a way to encourage those folks to get support from their districts in entering a teacher preparation program. So I think it can go, it goes both ways. When you involve community members, it definitely I think is primarily a benefit to the school, but it can be done in ways that are reciprocal.
I definitely would agree with that. And also too, I think about like just doing community-based research. And I just want to give a plug for community-based educational research and PAR research as a way to get people in the community and students and other stakeholders involved in identifying and voicing what the concerns are and working together to address them. I think that's a good strategy for bringing schools and communities and families together.
Great. Well, I think we're out of time, and I apologize for folks who we were not able to get to their questions, but I think this is a really powerful note to end on. So thanks again, Dr. Brown and Dr. Anyon, for your words and for your engagement and discussion. MAT folks, we will join our workshop room with Dr. Brown at about 6:40. So let's take a little bit of a break. But besides that, thanks everyone for coming. And please sign up for our newsletter so we can tell you about our next speaker series. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.